because healthcare costs are going up, education costs are going up, housing costs are going up. So when we think outside of the box, the proposition that we put out there is to say that if somebody in America is working 40 hours a week, that person should not be living in poverty.
Why do you think he said think outside the box? Why do you think he said that? Part of the reason Sanders says that is because the issue itself is the way the system allocates resources. And for the longest time, we accept as a society somebody making $7.25 an hour, despite the fact that there is no way, under any circumstances, a person can actually live off that. We would also say that we don't like the government creating jobs, meaning the right wing would say that anyway. So you have a private sector that is incapable of paying people a decent wage, and a political party that is captured by that private sector that says we also don't want the government creating jobs that could pay those people a decent and living wage. Bernie Sanders is asking you to step outside the system to which you were born and that you've organized your point of view and your thinking. Even when we think of things, we often think of those things in terms of dollars and cents, despite the fact that the dollars and cents aren't real at all, but the resources that we're talking about are actual real things. There is no point at all to this existence. From a corporeal point of view, none. You didn't come with an operation manual when you were born. You were thrust into a particular society. You had things that were dumped into you, things that you accepted, political points of view, and you operate from there. You just are. The choices that you have in this case are not even entirely your own choices. You have a media class that is for the most part of the 1%. You have a political class that is part of the 1%. And you have that class that dominates the chatter and the conversation, deprioritizing items of economics, especially from the things that stand from the standpoint of the poor and the middle class. What the middle class and the poor or the voters want has little to no representation in the standpoint of the actual laws that are being passed. He's asking you to do something that for the most part we have not done for nearly half a century. Step outside your system and ask yourself whether or not the way we've been operating is fair or is right. And you, as part of, let's say, the 99%, and again, there is no point to this particular existence. You can organize yourself any way you want to, providing that the lines of logic, meaning from the standpoint of action and consequence, is consistent. You can do that, and considering you can do that, we've organized ourselves in an odd particular way. And the way that we think about our world is somewhat strange, considering that we, the 99%, get the shaft in this process. He's asking you to think of the world in somewhat of a different way, and he's going with this notion of elevating the consciousness of the individuals in the country, because it's not enough for him to win. If he's to get anything he wants from the standpoint of healthcare, education, he needs the public to understand and realize that they are worth those things. You as a person have value, not in an absolute sense, but in the sense that we, even from the standpoint of our social contract, to some degree acknowledge that human beings have value. We even acknowledge that in order for a human being to function in the most basic of ways, they need an education, hence the public school system. We acknowledge that we don't want old people living and dying on the streets, hence we give Social Security. These are things that make our society better, not worse. The same thing is true from the standpoint of providing health care, meaning a healthy society and a society that allows for the productivity of the people in that society to be expressed by going through school and coming up with their own ideas in regards to the way they want to pursue their life. Those things are better for our society, not worse. But it's not the easiest thing in the world to get a society that has been pushed and cajoled into this belief that you can't have nice things by a political and media establishment that for the most part can afford those nice things for themselves. You can organize yourself in any way you want, providing it is consistent. And this notion of value, those things that we value are contextual, and those things are specific to the individual. We as a collective can come together as a society and prioritize the things that we care about. especially if those things are beneficial to us as a whole, i.e. healthcare, i.e. education, and yeah, food and getting rid of poverty and homelessness. It's a different political campaign. It goes beyond just winning. It goes into increasing the consciousness of the nation itself. Sanders gets prizes because he's been consistent for the last 40 years on this front. And if you remember, back in 2016 in New Hampshire, Sanders actually ended up winning New Hampshire, shocking the shit out of essentially the entire political class, and if I'm not mistaken, being the first Jew to win a primary state. Nobody cared about that point. Everybody only cared about Hillary in this case. Well, Sanders is running again in 2020. Clearly, he has not changed his step, clearly. And in New Hampshire, he is still, at this point, as a rear clear politics polling average in number 2. Buttigieg has shot up to number 1. Warren has collapsed. She's outright collapsed. As much as she has collapsed, Buttigieg has jumped up. I've said it on more than one occasion that Buttigieg is essentially feeding off the same blood vessel as Warren is. And as she goes down, he essentially has started to rise. I want to show what's taking place in New Hampshire. This video is not going to be quick. And I didn't like the way I started this video the first time around, so I killed that video and nobody will ever see the start of that video. However, I want to talk a little bit about New Hampshire, what is taking place in New Hampshire, and the shocking results of the average in the polling that is taking place within the context of Warren. She has collapsed. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal. Patreon, they demonetize these videos, so this content is really brought to you by you. And as my wife likes to say, even $1 helps, because it does. This is Warren. Listen to her argument, because I want to make the point that her argument is wrong. And this is one of those understated differences between her and Sanders. If you notice, Sanders in that last one says step outside the system for the moment because he wanted you to not look at it through the lens of, okay, they're paying me $8 an hour. I guess this is what I am worth. But stepping out of that and getting rid of that false consciousness of this notion of worth and to look at yourself in somewhat of a different light as a person, as a human being, and as such, just by definition of being a person, we as a society inscribe certain things. Warren's argument is based more in this notion of corruption as the problem. She's talking about this in the context of climate.
Because understand this. You want to understand the climate crisis in America today? It's 25 years of corruption that brought us here. Corruption.
That's not true. Now, it's not so much that corruption is not a problem. Corruption is. And if you are glad-handing, putting money in people's pocket, fair enough. That's true. But let's take that off the table for the moment. Are we saying that if you take all the other stuff off the table, meaning for people behaving corrupt, that everything is okay and that the system is fine? ExxonMobil knew about climate change for the last, 40 years. ExxonMobil, doing what good capitalists would do, got rid of those reports. Ultimately, you're stuck in a situation of myths, meaning our democratic system and these ideals and laws and things that we ascribe to and that we organize ourselves around. And self-interest, meaning getting back material gains and having a certain degree of status in comparison to other people who are in the country. ExxonMobil's objective in this, the highest objective, capitalistic system that intersects our democratic system, profit. Set of myths that we ascribe to on one end, profitability on the other. Which one do you think is going to win? I mean, ultimately, us being human beings living on this planet is a real thing. By the same token, the capitalistic system is almost like a game space that overlaps that actual real thing. Or let's say it's under that real thing. The capitalists ascribe to that game space. That game space, and all of us around, just from a cultural standpoint, says maximize your profit. Now, somebody would hope that there would be the good sense to realize that if your profit is coming at the expense of the planet itself, and you're trying to destroy the planet in your pursuit of profit, that that's somewhat of a bad thing. The catch here is, if you're one of those people that is making that profit, that is not necessarily on the top of your list. And when the planet goes kaput, you're not going to be here anyway, so what do you care? We expect people who we tell to maximize profit to have a limit on that and to self-govern themselves in some kind of odd way that they will acquiesce to the real limits of the planet. I don't know why you believe that. Think about animal agriculture. That's the other side of the coin in regards to climate change. We have animals, for the most part, we have, those animals eat up more land and everything else, but we accept that. And despite the fact that this industry is causing half of the climate change thing, that's not necessarily a corrupt part of the process. That's just the process in and of itself. I mean, these are industries that, for the most part, just in the way that they operate, even without corruption, destroys the planet. What about shipping? What about cars? I mean, we could have a system where we have trolleys and trains and trams and those type of things that stretch across the country, but we don't do that. We use cars. There's nothing corrupt in that process. It's entirely just a profit-seeking enterprise. But from the standpoint of oil and gas, from the standpoint of cars, even from the standpoint of the way we get food, meaning we would create a trade deal and we would ship oranges from some other country to like California, despite the fact that California can make its own oranges if it just prioritizes it. But because cash being the main driver, if you can monetarily get it cheaper, then you do it. It doesn't matter of the societal or the climate impact from having a ship to go from point A to point B when it's unnecessary. Cash itself becomes the highest objective and everything else becomes subordinate to that. Even if you take out corruption from the process, you still end up with a major problem from the standpoint of climate, just in the operations of the system itself. When Sanders makes this argument to step outside of it, he's making this point that it's not just corruption, meaning it's not this secondary thing outside of the system itself. That's not a bug, that is a feature. This pitch is apparently wearing thin. Either people don't believe her, or people have found their other new shiny object. Buttigieg, average in New Hampshire, 20. Sanders, average in New Hampshire, 17. Warren, average in New Hampshire, 14.3. Now you can say that's not that bad, but look at this. Buttigieg is up 11. Warren is down 10.7. They are feeding off of the same blood vein. And in this case, people who were supporting Warren apparently find Buttigieg just as acceptable as Warren. Just to be clear, though, she's lost nearly 11 points in New Hampshire. That is a collapse. And that's not one poll, that is the average of polls, meaning there must be several polls, more and less than that, where she is just, for the most part, taking an L. Now, a lot of this has to do with the rollout of her Medicare for All plan. Don't let people convince you that the issue was Medicare for All. The issue was that she was untrusted on that issue. The moment that you get on the debate stage and people are saying, Sanders is being honest, why aren't you? Sanders is being honest, why aren't you? Sanders is not hiding the ball. And Sanders is telling people exactly what people would expect. Yes, your taxes will go up moderately in order to compensate for getting rid of all of your other healthcare bills. They expect that. They expect for there to be skin in the game. From the standpoint of Warren, for her saying, no, I'm not going to increase middle class taxes, it's an unbelievable position right off the bat. And then she put out her plan, and you have the other Democratic candidate saying this is a unicorn, trying to buy a unicorn. And then she put out to Medicare for All, and honest people looking at it could say, this is not Medicare for All. She puts out a public option that she has been calling Medicare for All for 3 months, with this fig leaf of the politically impossible that she's going to get 2 bites at the apple in the course of 3 years. And that's assuming that the plan that she's putting out, the public option, even gets passed in the time frame that she's talking about. Politically, people can look at this and say this is no chance for success. On paper, the people who want to believe it would say, well, Warren has a pathway to Medicare for all. This is, for all intents and purposes, Pete's plan. And if indeed this is Pete's plan, why don't we just go to Pete, who's being honest about his plan? The problem with Warren wasn't Medicare for all. Sanders hasn't gone anywhere. He's still where he is. If the issue was Medicare for all, you would have thought Sanders would have also taken an L in the precipitous collapse of Warren. No, this is all her. This is everything to do with the way she rolled out Medicare for all, and it came across as just patently dishonest. Look at what she's putting forth, and do you honestly believe that Warren is going to get 2 bites at the apple? Or do you think a political actor wanted to staple herself to Bernie Sanders, scream Medicare for all because she understood that Medicare for all was popular, and when she got pushed on it, and she tried to come out with her plan at the last minute, people found it, unbelievable that they wouldn't have to put any money in on it, meaning only millionaires and billionaires are going to pay. They found that unbelievable. But on the second point, when she did come out with the plan, it was clear that politically, she was not going to get 2 bites at the apple any more than Obama was going to get 2 bites at the apple for Obamacare. She was being disingenuous. She wanted to support Medicare for all from the standpoint of optics. By the same token, in reality, political reality, it was all political expedience. The real world terms of it was a public option. But there's nothing wrong with the public option. The issue here is that the dishonesty and pushing it for all of this time. I would put to you that Warren's collapse has more to do with that than Medicare for all in and of itself. Just saying. Just saying. Captain N, keep up the good work. Been following you for a year. Oh, welcome to the team, Captain N. Thank you, man. Your mic has a cardio mode usually represented by a heart. You can make it more directional and point it at your face. It'll pick up less noise. Well, thank you, Baltazar. And let's see. I guess it's... Alright, I'm going to have to play around with it. It sounded okay when I was listening to it earlier. But perhaps it is picking up more than I want. Alright. Like, share, subscribe. Zalex, all polls are fake and analysis based on polls are polemic, false, fantasy, figments of imaginary fairness. Yeah, I'm going to say no to that. I mean, look, you can say that any particular number in a poll is only a snapshot. The thing that's more important are trends. This poll is not just one poll. This is a multitude of polls. A combined average showing her dropping 10 points. Now, you can't tell me that you get a multiple number of polls together and all of them are wrong when all of them are showing the exact same thing. Whatever the number is less important. The trend is the thing that's important. I keep saying that because it keeps showing up. Biden getting the older black vote, that keeps showing up. That seems to be a trend. That seems to be something that's legit. Sanders getting the younger vote, that seems to be legit. You can't say polls are false in the context of the trends that those polls show. Baltazar, the sad thing is Pete Borghese isn't even the honest with his plan. By keeping a PO, he's going to make a high-risk pool, and that will cause it to be shredded by the private industry. Well, look, he's doing the same thing with the college plan. If you remember, he puts out that attack video attacking Sanders' plan to get rid of debt and to have free public colleges. And what does he do? He lies first because he's talking about millionaires when really that's going to go all the way down to people making like $150,000. And again, if you live in D.C., $150,000 is nothing. You pay much of that just on rent. But then you have to pay healthcare, car, everything else. So he's not even being honest with that particular plan. But the plan is going to have a contradiction where those people who need it and won't be able to get it, who are making like $150,000, will be subsidizing people who are getting it. Those people who are making $150,000, who are not balling by any stretch of the imagination, who also need their kids to be in that, and will be taking out school loans in addition to paying taxes for a program that they won't be able to access, will be antagonistic towards that program. He's creating hostilities just within the basis of the program. And even on that, you have to believe that Buttigieg would even go through with doing it. And if you don't believe Warren, I have no idea why you believe Pete. Pete has no accomplishment to his name at all. And even as a mayor, he has one failure after the next. But this mayor, who has less votes than I have subscribers, is out here promising this stuff. And these liberals, it makes them feel good. I keep saying he's gay Obama. He's a gay man that has a poise and a blank slate, like Obama, where you can pretty much hoist whatever you want to him from the standpoint of policy. He just makes them feel good. It's just so happened that these liberal elites that are going from Buttigieg to Warren or Kamala Harris, their life is probably, for the most part, relatively stable in regards to economic vulnerability. Not that they're necessarily balling, but for the most part, the concerns and the needs and the fears that many of the people who are in the other class are not the same as theirs. Their ability to float between Buttigieg and Warren to some degree gets that across. I mean, these are different political acts. Warren, at the very least, believes the Wall Street stuff. Warren, at the very least, believes the wealth tax. At least I think she does. Buttigieg is a blank slate. He doesn't believe anything. Ultimately, you have somebody who's screaming about progressive values and being paid a ton by billionaires. What I would tell you this is that billionaires are not going to be dumping a bunch of money into somebody that is going to go after billionaires. You're being had. Again. You're being had. Again. Let's see. All right, last one. The pronunciation is bourgeoisie. 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 No, but that's not what you wrote. You wrote something else. You wrote bourgeoisie. Oh, you did. I'm sorry. You're right. You're right. You're right. You're right. You're right. I thought you were going somewhere else with that. You're absolutely right. The natural progressives. If we get Warren, our worse. Trump will be reelected. So Trump will be reelected. I got to be honest. Personally, I think anybody but Sanders, Trump gets reelected. Biden, look, if this was 2008 or 2000, if this was 2008, you have a different Joe Biden. This Joe Biden is not altogether there cognitively, and I think he will get roughed up. A, he can't raise money, and B, there are all sorts of problems associated with this kid and corruption that will come out and run across the screen every bit as much as Hillary Clinton's emails. So we will see. I would say this. There are a lot of people who are underestimating Sanders in the same way that they underestimated Trump. Oh, it can't be Sanders. It won't be Sanders, people would say. At our family dinner, they would be like, I like Sanders, but it won't be Sanders. The elderly are terrified of this notion of any level of change. So we don't want to go with something that may be a risk. So we are deadening our expectations and just going with the Joe Biden. The youth will be a large share of the voting bloc this year. And I think people are going to be shocked as shit when Sanders is pulling out and taking this. I strongly believe Sanders is going to win this. Now, people can say they don't believe it. The Democratic Party is going to stop him. They can say all that stuff. But in my head, and looking at the way the polling and everything else is going, he is well positioned to take this. And this is honestly the first time in my lifetime, and I would argue in your lifetime, where you've ever had anybody like him saying the things that he's saying, making these arguments about class, that is in a position to take the Democratic nomination. His job, his objective, is not only to raise the consciousness of the American public, but to also create a hegemonic shift in our politics. He's trying to drag the conversation in the country to the left. And for the first time in our lifetime, there's a potential to do it. Balthazar, Pete is the Keebler elves that escape with sessions from the tree-based cookie manufacturing industry. He is Macron. He is, what's the gentleman in Canada? Jesus Christ, his name dropped from me. But you get my point. He's Obama, he's Macron, he is... Oh, I can see his face. He's like a Ken doll. He's the Ken doll in Canada. Trudeau, that's it. Justin Trudeau. He's just this section of neoliberal politician. He tells you happy things that makes you feel good about yourself, especially if you're just the liberal left or the liberal side of the spectrum. He's gay, so that helps. They want to put somebody in from the standpoint of identitarian reasons. But from the standpoint of policy, it's farcical to believe that you're going to get something from Pete. I don't know why they believe it. But again, it makes them feel good about themselves. And so they run with it. The catch here is, what section of Warren's support is for Sanders? Meaning, if Warren wasn't in the race, and if Warren turned around and endorsed Sanders, what section of her support will go to Sanders? I will tell you this. The combination between Sanders and people who would support Warren would be winning this race. Now, the catch here is that a section of Warren's support would go to Buttigieg, as you're seeing in this poll, or in these collection of polls. This is not one poll, this is collection. This is the average. The question is, what section of that would go to Sanders? That's my question. I am enamored by that question. If Sanders turned around and said, I'm making Warren my VP if I win this thing, if I win this primary, what segment of her support would go to Sanders? And would that be enough to essentially overtake Biden? I'm fascinated by the question. I don't want him to choose Warren for his VP, by the way. But would that unify that voting bloc where it all falls under one umbrella as opposed to being split into two? I mean, right now, Buttigieg is taking the number one spot. But again, Sanders and Warren is more than Buttigieg. And Sanders and Warren is even more or just as much as Biden and Buttigieg. Like that voting bloc, man. There's a segment of that voting bloc that believes Warren and Sanders are very similar, if not a one-to-one. They need to be disabused of that point of view. And it's still not out of mind for me for Warren to have gotten into this race with the notion of sapping some of his steam in order to allow somebody like a Biden or Buttigieg to slide through. Wouldn't shock me in the least. But nevertheless, he's still in a good position to take it. Krillin 876, ever notice farm subsidies are not called socialism? Isn't that weird? We subsidize sugar. Not to mention we subsidize these other things. But yeah, you're right. We never call that socialism. Those are just called farm subsidies. And I guess technically that's not really socialism. I mean, that's investment into various industries. We need a rework. We never take the opportunity to think about whether or not the things that we've dragged with us from a historical context are relevant and still necessary. This notion that we allow people to walk around with $1 billion, let alone $100 billion, is obscene. And a society that's rational would not allow such a thing. We don't allow people to walk around with missile launchers. Why? Because there's a detrimental effect on the society if that person starts shooting off those missile launchers. By the same token, we would allow a capitalistic system to intersect our democratic order and drop in hundreds of thousands, if not millions or billions of dollars into our political system in order to sway public, for one, to get them to support things that are not in their personal best interests. And we call that democracy, despite the fact that the public is being gaslighted and lied to by people who have a very specific interest in maintaining the system the way it is. We need a rework. It never happens without a war. That's the catch. There was an article that just came out that made this point that when there is large disparities in income within the context of societal resources, that those societies tend to be chaotic, unhealthy, and for obvious reasons. I mean, the moment that you have a 1% that is doing things that is in their interest, but not in the interest of the large society, by definition, you're going to create a certain degree of chaos and havoc within the society because, again, the needs of the people in the society are not being met. We, in this country, die earlier than other countries. Our infant mortality rate is higher than other countries, and yet we pay twice as much for healthcare. This also goes into this notion of suicide, people using pills and drugs just to get by. And we never ask the question, is this a sickness within the culture itself and the way that we operate? We look at these things as individual scenarios. They are not, any more than homelessness or any more than chronic illness are just individual scenarios. Especially when you look over the distribution of people in your society and you see that there's a large distribution that tend towards a particular direction, then ultimately you're stuck with a human being in the context of our particular society ends up coming out in these ways by this percentage of the time. If that percentage is high, whether it's obesity, whether it's illness, whether it's death, then there's something wrong with your society. And we never ask the question, is there a cultural issue? We chest thump as if we're the pinnacle in this case. We are just a stop along the way of a better society. And the catch here is that better society, in the same way that they got rid of kings and queens, will no longer allocate money to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars to billionaires. And hopefully that new society will look at this stuff and find that to be somewhat of an atrocious thing, just like we had people fighting lions in a cage in Rome, or that we had personal slaves in the Americas. At some point, this has to fucking change. This cannot keep going on the way that it's going. And with the standpoint of the climate emergency, it adds that much more oomph into this point of change. Warren is making this argument as if capitalism is somehow can work in accordance with the environment. Capitalism only looks at the environment as a tool to exploit. Climate change doesn't factor into the equation, especially from the standpoint of money to be made. If a gas company could stop a solar power company from coming to fruition, they have done so, and they potentially would do so again. What happened to the electric car? If you notice, the electric car came out back in the 80s. If I'm not mistaken, the company bought up all those cars and took those things off the street. Yeah, I don't have this belief that the capitalism works in tandem with the environment. I just don't buy it. We need something else. I mean, part of this issue is power, where power resides. If you have power residing entirely within the context of the government, you have this overbearing government that can exert control. Oh, we're going to get rid of marijuana, we're going to make that illegal, etc., etc. By the same token, if you leave it into the hands of a 1%, that 1% is for the most part unaccountable. If you believe that government is corrupt and you have all of these people that have their hands in a cookie jar, why do you believe that the 1% singularly, with all this power and domination, wouldn't act in ways that is entirely within their best interest as opposed to the interests of everyone else? The issue is where power resides. Maybe something like a public ownership for vital industries, so things like power and gas and utilities, those things are under always public ownership of these kind of organizations that are there entirely and specifically, not necessarily under the auspices of the government, but on the auspices under public control. We need a different way of organization. This isn't cutting it. And I don't see how this can perpetuate itself, especially again in the face of what is now being considered a climate emergency. And by the way, you can't run on climate. I know a lot of liberals like to bring up climate. That's not something you can run on. If a person is driving Uber or trying to feed his family, he doesn't give a shit about the climate. Climate only gets cared about when people's needs are met. And at that point, they can pop their head up and say, oh yeah, there are higher things that we care about, especially now since we have our basic needs met. An argument for climate has to go through this notion of ensuring that each and every person in this country is covered. And I mean that from a standpoint of housing. I mean that from a standpoint of food. Libertarians like to make this argument as if people have choice. If you are hungry or if you need somewhere to stay, that's not a choice. That is you being compelled by your needs. There's a difference in those things. All right, I'm going to end this because this video has gone far, far too long. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.